When I was 14, I used to hate staying at my aunt's house. It wasn't that she was mean or that the place was dirty. It was just unsettling. She lived alone in a small, two-story house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by fields and forest. There was something about the quiet out there that made my skin crawl. But my parents had to go out of town for the weekend, so I didn't have a choice. "It'll be fun," my mom said as she packed my bag. "Your aunt could use the company." I didn't argue. What was the point? But as soon as I got there, I regretted it. The house was old, the kind of place where the floors creak with every step and the windows rattle when the wind blows. My aunt seemed happy to see me, though, so I put on a smile and tried to act normal. "I made up the guest room for you," she said, leading me upstairs. The room was small, with a twin bed and a single window that looked out over the backyard. The wallpaper was peeling, and the air smelled faintly of mothballs. "Thanks," I said, forcing a smile. But as soon as she left, I felt it, that strange heaviness in the air, like the room was watching me. The first night was uneventful. I stayed up late watching TV in the living room while my aunt read in her room upstairs. Around midnight, I decided to head to bed. I didn't sleep much, though. The bed was lumpy, and the house made all kinds of weird noises, creaks, groans, and the occasional tap on the walls. By morning, I was exhausted. "You look tired," my aunt said over breakfast, her eyes scanning my face. "I didn't sleep well," I admitted. She nodded. "This house takes some getting used to." I wanted to ask her what she meant, but something in her tone stopped me. That afternoon, my aunt had to run some errands, so I stayed home alone. I spent most of the day in the living room, flipping through channels and trying not to think about how quiet it was. Around 3 p.m., I heard it, a soft knock at the back door. I froze, my heart racing. The back door was at the far end of the kitchen, out of sight from where I was sitting. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaking. No answer. I grabbed a flashlight from the coffee table and crept toward the kitchen, my hands shaking. When I peeked around the corner, the door was wide open. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I saw the footprints, bare, wet footprints leading from the back door to the center of the kitchen. "Hello?" I called again, louder this time. Still no answer. I followed the footprints, my chest tightening with every step. They stopped near the kitchen table, where the floorboards creaked under my weight. That's when I heard it. Breathing. It was faint, like someone trying to stay quiet, but it was definitely there. I spun around, shining the flashlight into the shadows. Nothing. The breathing stopped, and for a moment, the house was silent. Then, the door slammed shut behind me, the sound so loud it made me jump. I ran to the door, locking it and double-checking the windows before calling my aunt. She didn't answer, so I left her a voicemail. "Someone was in the house," I said, my voice shaking. "Please come home." When she got back an hour later, she found me sitting in the living room, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. "What happened?" she asked, her face pale. I told her about the footprints and the breathing, but she didn't seem surprised. "This house is old," she said, her voice calm. "It makes a lot of noises." "Noises don't make footprints," I snapped. She didn't respond. That night, I locked my bedroom door and pushed a chair against it for good measure. I kept the flashlight under my pillow and left the light on, even though my aunt said it would make it harder to sleep. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of tapping on the window. At first, I thought it was a tree branch, but when I sat up, I realized there were no trees near that side of the house. The tapping grew louder, more frantic, like someone drumming their fingers against the glass. My breath caught in my throat as I turned to look. There was a face staring at me. It was pale, almost ghostly, with dark, sunken eyes that seemed to glow in the dim light. Its mouth was twisted into a wide, unnatural grin, and its hands were pressed against the glass, leaving smudges on the surface. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The face tilted to the side, as if studying me, and then it spoke. "Let me in." I scrambled out of bed, grabbing the flashlight and shining it at the window. The face disappeared, leaving nothing but darkness and the faint outline of the trees outside. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When I told my aunt about it the next morning, she gave me a long, searching look. "This house has history," she said finally. "What kind of history?" I asked, my voice trembling. She hesitated. "It's better if you don't know." I never stayed at my aunt's house again after that weekend. She sold it a few months later, saying it was too much for her to keep up with. But sometimes, late at night, I hear tapping on my bedroom window, and I know it's still out there, waiting. When I was 16, my family moved to a new house at the edge of a forest. It wasn't a big house, and the forest wasn't anything special. Just a cluster of old trees with a narrow dirt path that wound its way through the woods. My mom said it was charming, and my dad loved that it was so quiet, so far from the city. But I hated it. There was something about the way the trees cast long shadows over the yard, even in the middle of the day, that made my skin crawl. And at night, the woods seemed alive, full of strange noises and whispers that I couldn't explain. My parents said I was imagining things, but I wasn't. The first time I saw him, it was just after sunset. I was sitting on the back porch, scrolling through my phone, when I noticed something move between the trees. At first, I thought it was a deer or maybe a neighbor walking their dog. But as the figure stepped into the fading light, I realized it wasn't either of those things. It was a man. He was tall and thin, with long, bony arms and a pale, almost translucent face. He wore a tattered coat that hung loosely over his frame, and his eyes were dark, empty, like black holes in his skull. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, staring at me from the edge of the woods. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "Mom," I called, my voice shaking. She came out a moment later, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "What is it, Claire?" "There's someone in the woods," I said, pointing. She frowned, stepping onto the porch and squinting into the trees. "There's no one there," she said finally. I turned back, but the man was gone. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face. Those hollow eyes, that twisted expression. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I'd been seeing shadows or a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew better. Around midnight, I heard it. A soft tapping, like fingers drumming against glass. I sat up, my chest tightening as I stared at the window. The tapping came again, louder this time. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it toward the window. At first, I didn't see anything. The glass reflected the light back at me, showing only my pale, frightened face. Then, just as I was about to look away, I saw him. He was standing just outside the window, his face pressed against the glass. His dark, empty eyes locked onto mine, and his lips curled into a wide, unnatural smile. I screamed, scrambling back against the wall. The man didn't move. He just stared at me, his breath fogging up the glass. "Claire, what's going on?" my dad shouted, bursting into the room. "There's someone outside," I said, pointing at the window. He grabbed a baseball bat from the closet and threw open the curtains. But the man was gone. The next morning, I told my parents everything. The man in the woods, the tapping at the window. They didn't believe me. "Probably just a bad dream," my dad said, ruffling my hair. "You've been stressed with the move." I didn't argue, but I knew what I saw. I started avoiding the backyard after that, keeping my curtains closed and refusing to go outside after dark. But it didn't matter. He always found a way to get closer. The second time I saw him, it was in the middle of the day. I was home alone, sitting in the living room, when I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned and saw him standing at the edge of the yard, his head tilted to the side like he was studying me. My stomach dropped. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my fingers shaking as I explained the situation to the operator. By the time the police arrived, the man was gone. "He was right there," I said, pointing to the spot where he'd been standing. The officer frowned, scanning the yard. "There's no one here now." They searched the woods but didn't find anything. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing to suggest anyone had been there. But I knew better. That night, I locked all the doors and windows, double-checking every latch before heading to bed. I kept a flashlight and a kitchen knife on my nightstand, my heart racing with every creak and groan of the house. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of scratching. It was faint at first, like fingernails dragging across wood. I grabbed the flashlight and shined it toward the door. The scratching stopped. I stayed awake the rest of the night, jumping at every sound. By morning, I was exhausted, my nerves completely shot. When my parents asked what was wrong, I told them about the scratching, about how I felt like I was being watched. "You're imagining things," my mom said, shaking her head, but I wasn't. A few nights later, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, moving through the house with a steady rhythm. I grabbed the flashlight and crept to the door, my heart pounding in my chest. When I opened it, the hallway was empty. But the footsteps didn't stop. They were coming from downstairs. I hesitated, my hand trembling as I gripped the flashlight. "Mom? Dad?" I called, my voice shaking. No response. I made my way down the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. The footsteps grew louder, leading me toward the back door. When I reached it, I froze. The door was wide open, swinging gently in the breeze. I shined the flashlight into the backyard, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. At first, I didn't see anything. Then I saw him. He was standing at the edge of the woods, his dark eyes locked onto mine. "Why are you doing this?" I whispered, my voice trembling. He didn't respond. He just smiled. The police never found him. They said it was probably a drifter or someone passing through, but I know that's not true. Even now, years later, I still see him sometimes, standing at the edge of the woods, watching me with those dark, empty eyes. And I know he's waiting. I hated the basement in our house. It was one of those old, unfinished basements that smelled like damp cement and mildew. The walls were lined with wooden shelves filled with junk my parents had been collecting for years. Boxes of old books, broken appliances, Christmas decorations we hadn't used in forever. But what really creeped me out was the far corner. It was dark, even during the day, and there was this old furnace that made weird noises whenever it turned on. My dad said it was just the metal expanding and contracting, but it always sounded like whispering to me. "Stop being such a baby," my brother Chris used to say whenever I refused to go down there alone. "It's just a basement." But I knew it wasn't just a basement. It all started when I was 15. One night, I was watching TV in the living room while my parents were out. Chris was upstairs in his room, playing video games with his headphones on. I had just finished a bag of chips and was about to grab another snack when the power went out. The entire house went dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon outside. "Chris," I shouted, my voice echoing in the silence. "What happened?" No response. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, making my way toward the stairs. "Chris," I called again, shining the light up the steps. "What?" he shouted back, his voice muffled. "Did you mess with the breaker?" "No," he said, annoyed. "I'm in the middle of a game. Fix it yourself." I groaned, my stomach twisting as I turned toward the basement door. The breaker was down there. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. The basement always gave me the creeps, but now, with the power out and the house so quiet, it felt even worse. "Just get it over with," I muttered to myself, opening the door. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. When I reached the bottom, I froze. Something was wrong. The air was cold, colder than it should have been, and the faint smell of mildew was mixed with something else, something metallic, like rust or blood. I shined the flashlight around the basement, my hands shaking. Everything looked normal at first. The shelves, the furnace, the pile of old furniture my mom kept saying she'd sell but never did. But then I noticed it. A shadow, just at the edge of the light, near the far corner. It was tall and thin, too big to be a person, but too solid to be a trick of the light. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The shadow didn't move. I took a step closer, the floorboards creaking under my feet. The shadow seemed to shift, like it was watching me, and for a moment, I thought I saw something glint in the darkness. "Chris," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. I took another step, shining the flashlight directly at the shadow. But there was nothing there. I let out a shaky breath, trying to convince myself that I was imagining things. I found the breaker box on the far wall and flipped the switch, the lights flickering back on with a loud hum. The basement looked normal in the light, just a cluttered, dusty room filled with old junk. But as I turned to go back upstairs, I heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from the far corner. I froze, my heart racing. "Chris," I called, though I knew it wasn't him. The growl came again, louder this time, followed by the sound of something moving behind the shelves. I backed up, my flashlight shaking in my hand as I scanned the room. "Who's there?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The shelves rattled, and I heard a low, wet snarl, like an animal. I bolted up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind me. "What's your problem?" Chris asked as I burst into the living room, out of breath. "There's something in the basement," I said, my voice shaking. He rolled his eyes. "Seriously? You're freaking out over a mouse or something?" "It wasn't a mouse," I shouted. I don't know what it was, but it wasn't normal." He sighed. standing up and grabbing a baseball bat. "Fine, I'll check it out." I followed him to the basement door, my stomach twisting with every step. "You're wasting your time," he said, rolling his eyes as he opened the door. "There's nothing." He stopped mid-sentence, his grip tightening on the bat. The growling was louder now, echoing up the stairs like something massive was waiting in the darkness. "See?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Chris didn't answer. He took a step down, the bat raised in front of him like a shield. "Hello?" he called, his voice cracking. The growling stopped, replaced by the sound of heavy footsteps, like something with claws was moving across the concrete floor. Chris froze, his eyes wide. "Close the door," he whispered. "What?" I said, my heart racing. "Close the door," he shouted, stumbling back up the stairs. I slammed the door shut, locking it as Chris leaned against the wall, his face pale. "What the hell was that?" I asked, my voice shaking. He didn't answer, his eyes fixed on the door. The growling started again, louder now, followed by the sound of something scratching at the other side of the door. "We need to get out of here," Chris said, grabbing my arm. We ran out of the house, not stopping until we reached the end of the driveway. From there, we could see the basement windows, faintly glowing with the light from inside. For a moment, everything was still. Then, something moved. A dark, twisted shape pressed against the glass. Its glowing eyes locked onto us as it let out another low growl. "We're not going back in there," Chris said, his voice trembling. I didn't argue. The next day, my parents called an exterminator, thinking it was just a raccoon or some other animal that had gotten into the basement. But they didn't find anything. No tracks, no droppings, nothing to suggest that anything had been down there. I know what I saw, though, and I know it's still down there, waiting in the shadows. When I was 12, my family moved into a new house. It wasn't exactly new, though. The place was old, with creaky floors and peeling wallpaper, but my parents loved it. They said it had character, whatever that meant. All I saw was a house that looked like it belonged in one of those scary movies my older brother loved to watch. The first thing I noticed about the house was the locked door. It was upstairs at the end of the hall, a heavy wooden door with a rusted keyhole. "What's in there?" I asked my dad as we unpacked. "Just storage," he said, shrugging. "The realtor didn't have the key, so we'll probably have to get a locksmith to open it." But we never did. For the first few weeks, everything was fine. I spent most of my time in my room, reading or drawing, while my brother Jake played video games down the hall. My parents were busy with work and unpacking, and the house started to feel normal. But then I started hearing the noises. They were faint at first, soft creaks and taps, like someone walking across the floor or knocking on the walls. "Jake, stop it!" I yelled one night, convinced he was trying to scare me. "Stop what?" he shouted back from his room. "Making those noises." "I'm not doing anything." But the noises didn't stop. One night, I woke up to the sound of whispering. It was faint, just barely audible, but it was definitely coming from somewhere in the house. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding as I strained to listen. The whispers were coming from the direction of the locked room. I grabbed my flashlight and crept into the hall, the floorboards creaking under my bare feet. The whispers grew louder as I approached the door, my chest tightening with every step. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The whispers stopped. I stared at the door, my flashlight shaking in my hand. "Jake, if this is a joke, it's not funny," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. No response. I pressed my ear to the door, holding my breath. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, I heard it, a soft, muffled voice, like someone was speaking on the other side of the door. I stumbled back, my heart racing as I ran to Jake's room. "Wake up," I shouted, shaking him awake. "What's your problem?" he muttered, rubbing his eyes. "There's someone in the locked room," I said, my voice shaking. He groaned, pulling the blanket over his head. "You're just hearing things. Go back to bed." "I'm serious," I said, yanking the blanket off him. "Come see for yourself." "Fine," he said, sighing as he got out of bed. We stood outside the locked door, the house eerily quiet around us. "Do you hear it?" I whispered. Jake pressed his ear to the door, frowning. "I don't hear anything, but I swear." "It's just your imagination," he said, rolling his eyes. "Go to bed." I wanted to argue, but I didn't. Instead, I spent the rest of the night lying awake, staring at the ceiling and listening to the faint whispers that never seemed to stop. The next morning, I told my parents about the noises. "It's just an old house," my mom said, sipping her coffee. "Houses like this make all kinds of weird sounds." "But it's not just sounds," I said. "There's something in that room." My dad sighed, putting down his newspaper. "I'll call a locksmith next week, okay? We'll figure it out." But he never did. Over the next few weeks, the noises got worse. The whispers turned into voices, soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from the walls themselves. At night, I'd hear footsteps pacing back and forth in the hall, even though no one was there. Jake started noticing it too. "Do you think it's haunted?" he asked one night, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I said, staring at the locked door. "But I think whatever it is, it's in that room." One night, Jake and I decided to break in. "It's just a door," he said, holding a screwdriver. "How hard can it be?" I wasn't so sure, but I didn't want to chicken out. We worked on the lock for nearly an hour, trying to pry it open without breaking it. The whole time, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something standing in the shadows. Finally, with a loud click, the lock gave way. Jake pushed the door open, and we stepped inside. The room was empty. Well, mostly empty. There was an old wooden chair in the center of the room, covered in dust, and the walls were lined with faded wallpaper that peeled at the edges. "That's it," Jake said, frowning. "All that for this?" I didn't answer. Something about the room felt wrong, like the air was heavier, colder. I shined my flashlight around, my stomach twisting. That's when I saw it. The writing. It was faint, scrawled across the walls in what looked like charcoal. "Do you see that?" I whispered, pointing to the marks. Jake frowned, stepping closer. "What does it say?" We squinted at the writing, the words barely visible in the dim light. "Get out." Before I could respond, the door slammed shut behind us. Jake and I both jumped, spinning around as the flashlight flickered. "Did you do that?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "No," he said, his face pale. The air grew colder, and the whispers started again, louder now, echoing off the walls. "Open the door," I said, grabbing Jake's arm. He ran to the door, yanking at the handle. "It won't open," The whispers grew louder, turning into low, guttural voices that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I backed into the corner, my chest tightening as the flashlight flickered and died. "Jake!" I screamed. "I'm trying," he shouted, pounding on the door. Then, the voices stopped. For a moment, the room was silent. Then I felt it, a cold hand on my shoulder. I screamed, spinning around, but there was no one there. Jake finally got the door open, and we bolted out of the room, slamming it shut behind us. We didn't tell our parents what happened. The next day, my dad finally called a locksmith to change the lock. The room stayed shut after that, and the noises stopped. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers, and I know it's still there, waiting for someone to open the door again. When I was 13, my family moved to a small farmhouse in the countryside. It wasn't a bad place, quiet, surrounded by fields, and far from the noise of the city. My parents were excited about having a big garden, and my little sister, Lily, loved the idea of exploring the nearby woods. But I didn't like it. There was something about the house that felt off. Maybe it was the way the floorboards creaked when no one was walking on them, or how the windows always fogged up, even when it wasn't cold outside. But what really creeped me out was the old well in the backyard. It was covered with a rusted metal grate, surrounded by weeds and overgrown grass. My dad said it hadn't been used in decades, but I couldn't stop staring at it. It felt like it was staring back. The first time I noticed something strange was a few weeks after we moved in. Lily and I were playing in the yard, tossing a ball back and forth. She missed a catch, and the ball rolled toward the well. "I'll get it," she said, running after it. "Be careful," I shouted, my stomach twisting as she got closer to the well. She grabbed the ball and stood there for a moment, staring down at the grate. "What are you looking at?" I asked, jogging over to her. "There's something down there," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I frowned, peering through the rusty bars. The well was deep, so deep I couldn't see the bottom. But as I stared into the darkness, I thought I saw something move. A pale shape, shifting just out of sight. "Come on," I said, grabbing her arm. "Let's go inside." That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the well. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment over and over in my head. What had I seen down there? A trick of the light? An animal? Around midnight, I heard it. A faint, echoing voice, drifting up from the backyard. "Help me." I sat up, my heart racing. The voice came again, louder this time. "Help me, please." I got out of bed and crept to the window, pulling back the curtain. The yard was dark, lit only by the faint glow of the moon. But I could see the well, and something was moving near it. A shadow, long and thin, like a person crouching next to the grate. I froze, my chest tightening as the shadow reached out, its hand gripping the bars. Then it looked up. Its face was pale and hollow, with dark, sunken eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. "Help me," it whispered again, its voice soft but urgent. I stumbled back from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. When I looked again, the yard was empty. The next morning, I told my parents what I'd seen. "It was probably just a dream," my mom said, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "It wasn't a dream," I insisted. "I saw something out there." My dad sighed, putting down his coffee. "Look, I'll check the well later, okay?" But I'm telling you, there's nothing down there. I didn't argue, but I didn't believe him either. That afternoon, while my parents were out running errands, I decided to check the well myself. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and headed into the backyard, my stomach twisting with every step. The grate was heavy, covered in rust and moss, but I managed to pry it open. The well was even deeper than I thought, the walls lined with damp, crumbling bricks. I shined the flashlight into the darkness, my hands shaking. At first, I didn't see anything, but then, at the very bottom, something moved. It was a face, pale and twisted, with empty black eyes that seemed to stare right through me. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. It hit the ground and rolled toward the edge of the well, the beam shining straight down. The face was gone, but I could hear it breathing. I slammed the grate shut and ran back into the house, locking the door behind me. When my parents got home, I tried to tell them what had happened, but they didn't believe me. "You've got an overactive imagination," my dad said, shaking his head. But Lily believed me. "I've seen it too," she whispered that night as we sat in my room. "It watches me through the window." The next few nights were the worst of my life. Every night, I heard the voice calling to me, "Help me, let me out." It got louder each time, more insistent, until I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to end it. I waited until my parents were asleep, then grabbed the flashlight and headed into the backyard. The air was cold and still, the grass damp with dew. The grate creaked as I opened it, the sound echoing through the silent night. I shined the flashlight into the well, my heart pounding in my chest. "Who's down there?" I called, my voice trembling. The voice came again, soft and pleading. "Help me, please." I grabbed the rope my dad used for the garden and tied it to the metal bars, lowering myself into the well. The walls were slimy and cold, and the air grew heavier the deeper I went. When I reached the bottom, I saw it, a figure, hunched and twisted, its pale skin stretched tight over its bones. It turned to look at me, its black eyes glinting in the dim light. "Thank you," it whispered, its voice like broken glass. Then it lunged. I don't remember climbing out of the well. The next thing I knew, I was in my bed, the morning sun streaming through the window. I tried to tell my parents what had happened, but they just laughed it off. "You must have had a bad dream," my mom said, patting my head, but I knew it wasn't a dream. That afternoon, my dad sealed the well with concrete, saying it was a safety hazard. The voice stopped after that, but I still feel it sometimes. The weight of those empty black eyes, watching me from the shadows. And I know it's still down there, waiting for someone else to open the well. When I was 15, my best friend Sarah dared me to go camping with her in the woods behind her house. She'd been talking about it for weeks, saying how cool it would be to sleep outside under the stars, cook hot dogs over a campfire, and tell ghost stories. But I wasn't so sure. There was something about those woods that made my skin crawl. "They're just trees," Sarah said, rolling her eyes when I told her how I felt. "What are you so scared of?" I couldn't explain it. Maybe it was the way the shadows seemed darker under the canopy of leaves, or the way the air felt heavier the deeper you went. But I agreed to go. I wish I hadn't. We left just before sunset, Sarah carrying a bright yellow backpack stuffed with snacks, a flashlight, and a cheap pop-up tent she borrowed from her brother. The trail was narrow and overgrown, twisting through the trees like a tunnel. The further we went, the quieter it got. No birds, no insects, just the crunch of our footsteps on the dry leaves. "This is going to be so much fun," Sarah said, grinning as she looked over her shoulder. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "Fun." We found a small clearing about a mile into the woods, surrounded by tall, gnarled trees that seemed to lean toward us. "This is perfect," Sarah said, tossing her backpack onto the ground. She set up the tent while I gathered firewood, the sun dipping lower and lower until the forest was bathed in shadows. By the time we got the fire going, it was completely dark. "This isn't so bad," Sarah said, roasting a marshmallow over the flames. I nodded, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling in my chest. We spent the next hour laughing and telling stories, the fire crackling between us. But then, just as Sarah was in the middle of a joke, we heard it. A whisper. It was faint, almost too quiet to hear, but it was definitely there. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Hear what?" Sarah said, frowning. The whisper came again, louder this time, drifting through the trees like smoke. "Help me." Sarah's smile faded, her eyes darting toward the darkness beyond the firelight. "Okay, that's creepy," she said, her voice low. "It's probably just the wind." "That's not the wind," I said, my chest tightening. We sat in silence, listening as the whispering grew louder, more insistent. "Help me, please." Sarah grabbed the flashlight and shined it into the trees, the beam cutting through the darkness. There was nothing there. "Let's go back," I said, my voice shaking. "Are you serious?" Sarah said, trying to sound brave. "We just got here." But I could see the fear in her eyes. "Please," I said, grabbing her arm. "Something's not right." Before she could respond, we heard it, a low, rumbling growl, coming from the direction of the trail. My stomach dropped. "What was that?" Sarah whispered. We stood frozen, the fire crackling between us as the growling grew louder, closer. Then, just beyond the edge of the firelight, something moved. It was quick, a blur of shadow darting between the trees. "Who's there?" Sarah called, her voice trembling. No response. The growling stopped, replaced by the faint sound of footsteps circling the clearing. "We need to leave," I whispered, grabbing her arm. She didn't argue. We grabbed the flashlight and started down the trail, the beam of light bouncing with every step. The forest was pitch black, the shadows pressing in around us like walls. "Do you hear that?" Sarah whispered, glancing over her shoulder. I nodded, my stomach twisting. It was faint at first, like the rustle of leaves in the wind. But it wasn't the wind. It was footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, crunching through the leaves just a few feet behind us. "Run," I whispered, grabbing Sarah's hand. We took off down the trail, the flashlight swinging wildly as we stumbled over roots and rocks. The footsteps grew louder, faster, like whatever was following us was gaining on us. "Faster!" Sarah shouted, her voice breaking. "I'm trying." I shouted back, my lungs burning. We reached a small bridge that crossed a shallow creek, the planks creaking under our weight as we sprinted across. But as soon as we reached the other side, we stopped. The footsteps had stopped too. We turned, shining the flashlight back toward the bridge. There was nothing there, just the empty trail, stretching into the darkness. "Do you think it's gone?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. I don't know, I said, my chest tightening. The whisper came again, drifting through the trees. Help me, please. I grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her down the trail. We're almost there, I said, my voice shaking. Just keep moving. But then we heard it. A scream. It was high-pitched and raw, echoing through the forest like a blade slicing through the air. Sarah froze, her eyes wide. What was that? I didn't answer. I just kept pulling her, my heart pounding in my chest. The scream came again, louder this time, followed by the sound of something crashing through the trees. Go! I shouted, pushing her forward. We ran as fast as we could, the shadows twisting and shifting around us like living things. When we finally burst out of the woods and into Sarah's backyard, we collapsed onto the grass, gasping for breath. We sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the tree line, waiting for something to come out after us. But nothing did. The next day, we told Sarah's mom what had happened. She didn't believe us, of course. She said it was probably an animal, or maybe our imaginations running wild in the dark. But I know what I heard, and I know what I saw. I haven't been back to those woods since that night, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers. Help me. And I know it's still out there, waiting for someone else to wander too far into the trees. I never liked mirrors. It sounds silly, but there was always something about them that made me uncomfortable. It wasn't that I was scared of my own reflection or anything. It was just the way they seemed off, like they were showing more than just what was in front of them. When my family moved into our new apartment, I was relieved to see that my bedroom didn't have a mirror. At least, I was relieved at first. It wasn't until my mom brought home the antique vanity that everything changed. She found it at a thrift store, one of those old wooden ones with a big oval mirror and drawers on each side. "Isn't it beautiful?" she said, running her hand over the polished wood. I forced a smile, trying not to show how much I hated it. "Yeah, it's nice. It'll look perfect in your room," she said, grinning as she pushed it down the hallway. "Can't it go somewhere else?" I asked, following her. "Nonsense," she said. "It's for you." I didn't argue. The vanity fit perfectly against the wall opposite my bed, the mirror catching the sunlight that streamed through the window. "It's like it was made for this room," my mom said, stepping back to admire it. I nodded, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling in my chest. That night, I covered the mirror with an old blanket before going to bed. It made me feel a little better, but not much. The first night was uneventful. I fell asleep with the blanket draped over the mirror, the room dark and quiet. But the second night was different. I woke up around 2 a.m., my throat dry and my room strangely cold. I reached for the glass of water on my nightstand and froze. The blanket was gone. The mirror was uncovered, the faint light from the street lamp outside reflecting off its surface. At first, I thought my mom must have moved it, but then I noticed something. The mirror was fogged up, like someone had breathed on it. I stared at it, my chest tightening as I saw the faint outline of a handprint smeared across the glass. I scrambled out of bed, grabbing the blanket and throwing it back over the mirror. "Mom!" I shouted, running down the hallway. She came out of her room, rubbing her eyes. "What's wrong?" There's something wrong with the mirror," I said, my voice trembling. She frowned. "What are you talking about?" I woke up and it was uncovered, and there was a handprint. "It's just an old mirror," she said, cutting me off. You probably touched it yourself and forgot. Go back to bed. I didn't argue, but I knew she was wrong. The next morning, I told my dad what had happened. He laughed, shaking his head. It's just your imagination, he said. Mirrors don't do anything. They just reflect. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me through that glass. I tried to avoid the mirror as much as I could, keeping it covered during the day and turning it toward the wall at night. But it didn't help. The next time it happened, I was sitting at the vanity, brushing my hair before bed. The room was quiet, the only sound the soft hum of the ceiling fan. I glanced at my reflection, my stomach twisting as I noticed something strange. My reflection wasn't moving. I froze, my hand still holding the brush as I stared at the mirror. My reflection stared back, its eyes wide and unblinking. Then, slowly, it smiled. I dropped the brush, stumbling back from the vanity. The reflection didn't follow me. It just sat there, grinning. "Mom!" I screamed, running out of the room. She and my dad came rushing in, their faces pale. "What's going on?" my dad asked, looking around. "The mirror," I said, pointing at the vanity. "There's something wrong with it." They glanced at the mirror, their expressions softening. "It looks fine to me," my mom said, frowning. "No, I saw it," I said, my voice trembling. "My reflection. It wasn't me." "You're just tired," my dad said, putting a hand on my shoulder. "Get some sleep." I wanted to argue, but the look on their faces told me they wouldn't believe me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the blanket-covered mirror, my heart pounding with every creak and groan of the house. Around midnight, I heard it, a soft tapping, coming from the direction of the vanity. I pulled the blanket over my head, squeezing my eyes shut. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it sounded like someone was pounding on the glass. "Let me out," a voice whispered, so faint I almost didn't hear it. I stayed under the blanket until morning, my body trembling with fear. When the sun finally rose, I crept over to the vanity, my hands shaking as I pulled the blanket off the mirror. The glass was shattered, a web of cracks spreading across the surface. But my reflection was still there, staring at me with dark, hollow eyes. I screamed, running out of the room and slamming the door behind me. My parents found me in the hallway, tears streaming down my face. "I'm not going back in there," I said, my voice breaking. They didn't understand, but they didn't argue. The next day, my dad got rid of the vanity, taking it to the dump and promising me it was gone for good. But I know it's still out there, somewhere, and I know it's still watching. When I was 17, I started working part-time at a hotel. It wasn't one of those fancy 5-star places with marble floors and gold chandeliers. It was a small, old hotel on the edge of town, the kind of place where people stayed because they didn't have better options. I didn't mind the job, though. The pay was decent, and the work was easy, mostly checking guests in and out, answering the phone and restocking the snack bar. But there was one room in the hotel that everyone avoided. Room 303. The first time I heard about it was during my orientation. "Never book anyone in 303, the manager said, his voice low. "Why not?" I asked, glancing at the list of room numbers on the computer screen. He hesitated, his eyes darting to the door as if someone might overhear. "It's just off limits. Trust me." I nodded, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. What was so special about that room? For the first few weeks, I didn't think much about it. Most of the guests were nice enough, though a few were weird or rude. The hotel itself was quiet, the kind of place where nothing really happened. But every time I passed room 303, I felt it. A strange, heavy feeling, like the air was thicker around that door. One night, when I was restocking towels on the third floor, I stopped in front of it. The door was just like all the others, plain wood with a brass number screwed into the middle. But the doorknob was scratched, and the frame looked warped, like it had been broken and fixed more than once. I reached out, my hand hovering over the knob. Then I heard it, a faint tapping, coming from inside the room. I froze, my heart racing. The room wasn't supposed to be occupied. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaking. The tapping stopped. I waited, my hand still hovering over the knob, but there was no response. I backed away, my stomach twisting as I turned and hurried down the hall. When I told the manager what had happened, he just shook his head. "Stay away from that room," he said, his tone firm. "But I heard something," I said. "Someone was in there." "It's empty," he said, cutting me off. End of discussion. I didn't argue, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. A few nights later, I was working the night shift when the phone rang. "Front desk," I said, picking it up. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a faint, raspy voice came through the line. "Room 303. I froze, my grip tightening on the phone. "What about it?" "Help me," the voice whispered. The line went dead. I stared at the phone, my chest tightening. It had to be a prank, right? But when I checked the call log, it said the call had come from room 303. My stomach dropped. I grabbed the master key and made my way to the third floor, my hands shaking as I climbed the stairs. The hallway was dark and silent, the only sound the faint hum of the air conditioning. When I reached room 303, I hesitated. The door was slightly ajar, a thin sliver of darkness visible through the crack. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. No response. I pushed the door open, the hinges creaking as I stepped inside. The room was cold, colder than it should have been, and the air smelled faintly of mildew. The bed was neatly made, the furniture untouched. It looked like no one had been in there for years. But then I saw it, a single, wet footprint on the carpet, leading from the bathroom to the bed. "Is someone here?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The door slammed shut behind me, the sound so loud it made me jump. I spun around, grabbing the doorknob and yanking it open. The hallway was empty. I backed out of the room, my heart racing as I locked the door and hurried back to the front desk. The next morning, I told the manager what had happened. "You went into 303? He said, his face pale. "I thought someone was in there," I said. "The door was open and I saw." "You shouldn't have gone in," he said, cutting me off. "Why not?" I asked. "What's wrong with that room?" He sighed, rubbing his temples. "There's no way to explain it, but strange things happen in 303. Guests who stay there see things, hear things. Some of them disappear." "Disappear?" I said, my stomach twisting. He nodded. "We stopped booking it years ago. It's better that way." I wanted to believe him, but part of me thought he was just trying to scare me. Then, a week later, a guest checked into the hotel. "I'd like a room on the third floor," he said, sliding his credit card across the desk. "We have rooms available on the second floor," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "No," he said, shaking his head. "Third floor." I hesitated, glancing at the computer screen. The only room available on the third floor was 303. I told the manager about the guest, but he just sighed. "Give him the room," he said, his voice tired. "But you said—" "I know what I said," he snapped. "Just do it." I didn't argue. The guest checked into room 303 that evening, his suitcase rolling behind him as he made his way up the stairs. I didn't see him again. The next morning, when the housekeeper went to clean the room, she found it empty. The bed was made, the suitcase was gone, and the only sign anyone had been there was a single wet footprint on the carpet. The guest's car was still in the parking lot, but he was never seen again. I quit my job at the hotel a few weeks later. I couldn't take it anymore. The whispers, the cold spots, the feeling that something was watching me every time I passed room 303. I don't know what's in that room, and I don't want to know. But sometimes, late at night, I dream about it, and I can still hear the voice on the phone, whispering, "Help me." When my dad bought the old farmhouse, I thought he was joking. We lived in a small apartment in the city, and I couldn't imagine why anyone would want to move out to the middle of nowhere. But he said it was a fresh start for the family, a chance to get away from the noise, the stress, and the traffic. We'll have fresh air, open space, and all the quiet we could want, he said, grinning as he handed me the keys to my new room. I didn't argue. What was the point? But the moment we pulled into the long, gravel driveway and I saw the house, I felt it, that strange, creeping sense of unease that made my skin crawl. The farmhouse was old, really old. The paint was peeling, the roof sagged, and the windows were so dirty you couldn't see through them. The barn out back wasn't much better, its doors hanging crooked on rusted hinges. But the worst part was the well. It sat in the backyard, surrounded by weeds and overgrown grass, its wooden cover rotting and warped. "What's in there?" I asked as we unpacked. "Just an old well," Dad said, shrugging. "Probably hasn't been used in decades." I nodded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me. The first night in the farmhouse was strange. The house creaked and groaned like it was alive, and the wind howled through the gaps in the windows, making it sound like someone was whispering outside. I barely slept, tossing and turning in my creaky bed, jumping at every sound. Around 2 a.m., I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping, like someone was knocking on the wall. "Dad?" I called, my voice shaking. No response. I got out of bed, my feet freezing on the wooden floor as I made my way to his room. He was sound asleep, snoring softly. The tapping stopped as soon as I climbed back into bed. But just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard something else. A soft, muffled voice coming from the direction of the well. The next morning, I told my dad what I'd heard. "It's an old house," he said, sipping his coffee. "Houses like this make a lot of noise. You'll get used to it." But I wasn't so sure. As the days went on, the noises got worse. Footsteps on the stairs when no one was there. Soft, muffled laughter in the middle of the night. And always that strange, rhythmic tapping. I started avoiding the well, refusing to go near it even during the day. But it didn't matter. One afternoon, I was sitting on the porch, reading a book, when I saw something move near the barn. At first, I thought it was a shadow, a trick of the light. But then it moved again, stepping out from behind the barn and into the sunlight. It was a man. He was tall and thin, with a pale, almost translucent face and dark, hollow eyes. He wore a tattered coat that hung loosely over his frame, and his hands were stained with dirt. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, staring at me. "Dad!" I shouted, running into the house. "What's wrong?" he asked, looking up from his laptop. "There's someone outside," I said, pointing toward the barn. He frowned, grabbing a baseball bat from the closet. "Stay here." I watched from the window as he walked toward the barn, the bat clenched tightly in his hands. But when he got there, the man was gone. "There's no one out here," Dad said, coming back inside. "But I saw him," I said, my voice trembling. He sighed, shaking his head. "You've been watching too many scary movies. There's nothing out here but us." I didn't argue, but I knew what I saw. That night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, moving through the house with a steady rhythm. I grabbed my flashlight and crept to the door, my heart pounding in my chest. When I opened it, the hallway was empty. But the footsteps didn't stop. They were coming from downstairs. I hesitated, my hand trembling as I gripped the flashlight. "Dad?" I called, my voice shaking. No response. I made my way down the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. The footsteps grew louder, leading me toward the back door. When I reached it, I froze. The door was wide open, swinging gently in the breeze. I shined the flashlight into the backyard, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. At first, I didn't see anything. Then I saw him. The man was standing near the well, his dark eyes locked onto mine. "Why are you doing this?" I whispered, my voice trembling. He didn't respond. He just smiled. The next morning, I begged my dad to leave. "There's something wrong with this place," I said, my voice trembling. He sighed, rubbing his temples. "It's just your imagination," he said. "You'll get used to it." But I knew he was wrong. A few nights later, I woke up to the sound of whispering. It was faint at first, like someone speaking from far away. But as I sat up in bed, the whispers grew louder, more urgent. "Come outside," the voice said. I grabbed the flashlight and crept to the window, pulling back the curtain. The man was standing in the yard, his pale face illuminated by the moonlight. "Come outside," he said again, his voice low and raspy. I stumbled back from the window, my chest tightening as the whispers grew louder, echoing in my ears. "Come outside. Come outside." I don't remember falling asleep, but when I woke up, the whispers were gone. My dad decided to sell the house a few weeks later, saying it was too much work to fix up. We moved back to the city, and I tried to forget about the farmhouse. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers. "Come outside." And I know he's still there, waiting by the well. I should have never gone into that hospital. It was one of those places everyone in town talked about, the kind of building that was more legend than reality. People said it was haunted, that strange things happened there, but I never believed any of it. At least, I didn't until my friends dared me to go inside. "Come on, Jenna," Ryan said, grinning as he held up his phone. "We'll make a video, post it online. It'll be fun." "Yeah," Chloe added, her voice full of fake excitement. "What's the worst that could happen?" I didn't want to do it. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to stay away from that place. But I didn't want to be the only one chickening out, so I agreed. That was my first mistake. We left just after sunset, the sky turning a deep shade of purple as we made our way to the edge of town. The hospital loomed ahead of us, its dark silhouette standing against the horizon like a shadow. The windows were shattered, the walls covered in graffiti, and the front doors hung crooked on their rusted hinges. "This place is so creepy," Chloe said, her voice trembling. "That's the point," Ryan said, pulling out his flashlight. "Let's go." I hesitated, glancing back toward the road. "Are you scared?" Ryan teased, shining the flashlight in my face. "No," I said, even though my stomach was in knots. I followed them inside. The air inside the hospital was heavy and damp, the faint smell of mildew mixing with something metallic, like rust or blood. Our footsteps echoed through the empty halls, the sound bouncing off the crumbling walls. "This place is insane," Ryan said, pointing his flashlight at an old gurney that was tipped on its side. "Let's just get this over with," I muttered, crossing my arms. We made our way deeper into the hospital, the darkness pressing in around us like a living thing. That's when we heard it, a faint, echoing laugh. We all froze, our flashlights shaking as we scanned the hallway. "Did you hear that?" Chloe whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's probably just the wind," Ryan said, though he didn't sound convinced. The laugh came again, louder this time, followed by the sound of footsteps echoing through the hall. "Hello?" Ryan called, his voice trembling. No response. "Let's leave," I said, grabbing his arm. "Not yet," he said, shaking me off. "We haven't even made it to the operating rooms." I didn't want to argue, but the further we went, the worse the feeling in my chest got. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the peeling wallpaper and broken tiles blending into the darkness. Finally, we reached a set of double doors with a faded sign that read Operating Wing. "This is it," Ryan said, pushing the doors open. The room beyond was massive, with rows of old operating tables covered in dust and rusted medical tools scattered across the floor. "This is so creepy," Chloe whispered, shining her flashlight on one of the tables. Ryan started filming, his phone's light casting long shadows on the walls. "This is awesome," he said, grinning, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. As Ryan filmed, I wandered toward the far end of the room, where a broken window let in a faint breeze that made the curtains flutter. That's when I saw it. A shadow, long and thin, moving across the far wall. "Ryan," I whispered, my voice shaking. "Turn off the light." "What?" he said, lowering his phone. "Just do it." He turned off the light, plunging the room into darkness. That's when we saw it. The shadow was still there, standing perfectly still in the center of the room. It wasn't attached to anything. There was no person, no object, just the shadow. "What the hell is that?" Chloe whispered, her voice trembling. The shadow moved, its long, thin arms stretching toward us. "Run," I said, grabbing Chloe's arm. We bolted for the door, our flashlights swinging wildly as we stumbled into the hallway. But the shadow followed. It moved faster than it should have, darting across the walls like a living thing. "Get to the stairs," Ryan shouted, his voice echoing through the hall. We sprinted toward the stairwell, the sound of the shadow's footsteps pounding behind us. I could feel it, the cold air pressing against my back as we climbed the stairs, the darkness swallowing us whole. When we reached the second floor, we slammed the door shut behind us, gasping for breath. Did we lose it? Chloe whispered, her eyes wide. I don't know, Ryan said, his face pale. The second floor was worse than the first. The walls were covered in black mold, and the ceiling was caved in several places, letting in beams of moonlight that illuminated the debris on the floor. We need to get out of here, I said, my voice trembling. We can't go back down, Ryan said, glancing at the door. It's still down there. Then we'll find another way out, I said, grabbing Chloe's hand. We made our way down the hall, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. That's when we heard it. A voice, soft and raspy, coming from one of the rooms. Help me, it said, so faint it was almost a whisper. We froze, our flashlights shaking as we stared at the door to the room. Don't, I said, grabbing Ryan's arm as he reached for the handle. What if someone's in there? He said, his voice trembling. The voice came again, louder this time. Help me. Ryan pushed the door open. The room was empty. At least, it looked empty at first. But as we stepped inside, we saw it. A figure, hunched and twisted, crouching in the corner. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, and its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. Help me, it said again, its voice like broken glass. We backed out of the room, slamming the door shut behind us. We ran, our footsteps echoing through the halls as the figure's voice followed us. Help me. Don't leave me. We didn't stop until we reached the fire escape, bursting out into the cool night air. When we finally made it back to the car, we didn't say a word. We just drove, leaving the hospital and whatever was inside it far behind. I haven't spoken to Ryan or Chloe since that night. I don't know what we saw in that hospital, and I don't want to know. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the voice. Help me. And I know it's still waiting. When I was 18, I got a job as a camp counselor at a summer camp deep in the woods. It seemed like the perfect gig. Fresh air, plenty of sunshine, and a paycheck at the end of every week. Plus, I'd get to spend the summer hiking, swimming, and roasting marshmallows by the campfire. The camp itself was beautiful. There were rows of wooden cabins surrounded by tall pine trees, a crystal-clear lake, and endless trails that wound through the forest. But there was one part of the woods that the other counselors told me to stay away from. The northern trail is off limits, one of them said on my first day, his face serious. Why? I asked, raising an eyebrow. He shrugged. Just trust me. Weird stuff happens out there. I laughed it off, thinking they were just trying to scare the new girl. But I should have listened. The first week was easy. I spent my days teaching the kids how to build fires and tie knots, and my nights sitting around the campfire, listening to ghost stories. The other counselors were nice enough, but they all seemed on edge, like they were waiting for something to happen. One night, as we were cleaning up after dinner, I noticed one of the kids staring toward the northern edge of the camp. What's up, Emily? I asked, kneeling beside her. She pointed toward the trees, her face pale. There's someone out there. I followed her gaze, but the woods were empty. It's probably just a deer, I said, trying to sound calm. She shook her head, her eyes wide. It wasn't a deer. It was a man. I glanced at the other counselors, but they were too busy packing up to notice us. Come on, I said, taking her hand. Let's get you back to your cabin. But I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that someone was watching us. That night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. They were faint at first, barely audible over the rustling of the wind in the trees. But as I lay there, holding my breath, they grew louder, closer. I grabbed my flashlight and crept to the window, my heart pounding in my chest. The woods were dark, the shadows long and deep, but I could just make out the faint outline of a figure standing at the edge of the camp. It was tall and thin, with long arms that hung awkwardly at its sides. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move. I turned away from the window, grabbing my phone and dialing the camp director's number. "Something's outside," I whispered when he answered. "Stay inside," he said, his voice low. "I'll check it out." I sat on the edge of my bed, my flashlight clutched tightly in my hand as I listened to the footsteps fade into the distance. When the camp director came back, he told me he didn't see anything, but I could tell he was lying. The next day, I asked one of the other counselors about the Northern Trail. "What's the big deal?" I said, trying to sound casual. "It's just a bunch of trees, right?" She hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "People go missing out there," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Missing?" She nodded. "Hikers, hunters, even kids from the camp. They walk into the woods and never come back." I laughed nervously, but the look on her face told me she wasn't joking. Later that afternoon, I caught one of the kids, a boy named Ryan, sneaking toward the Northern Trail. "Where do you think you're going?" I called, jogging to catch up with him. He froze, his face turning red. "I just wanted to see it." "See what?" "The man in the woods," he said, his voice trembling. "Emily said he's real." My stomach twisted. "Emily was just imagining things," I said. "There's no man in the woods." But even as I said it, I wasn't sure I believed it. That night, the footsteps came again. This time, they didn't stop at the edge of the camp. They moved closer, circling my cabin with slow, deliberate steps. I lay in bed, my heart pounding as I clutched the flashlight, waiting for the sound to stop. But then I heard it, a soft tapping on the window. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The tapping came again, louder this time, followed by a faint, raspy whisper. "Come outside." I didn't move. The tapping grew more frantic, the voice more insistent. "Come outside. Come outside." I turned on the flashlight and pointed it at the window, my hand shaking. For a moment, I didn't see anything. Then, a face appeared. It was pale and twisted, with dark, hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through me. I screamed, stumbling back from the window. When I looked again, the face was gone. The next morning, I told the camp director what had happened. "It was probably just a prank," he said, though his face was pale. "Who would prank me in the middle of the night?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't answer. That afternoon, Ryan went missing. We searched the entire camp, calling his name and checking every cabin, but there was no sign of him. The camp director called the police, but even they couldn't find him. "He was talking about the Northern Trail," I said, my stomach twisting. "I think he went into the woods." The camp director's face went pale. "We don't go in there," he said. "Then where is he?" I shouted, my voice breaking. He didn't respond. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Ryan's face, his wide, terrified eyes as he disappeared into the trees. Around midnight, I heard it again. The footsteps. They were louder this time, more deliberate, like whoever, or whatever, was out there wanting me to hear them. Then came the tapping. Soft at first, then louder, more insistent. "Come outside," the voice whispered, so faint it was almost drowned out by the sound of the wind. I grabbed my flashlight and crept to the window, pulling back the curtain. The figure was there again, standing at the edge of the woods, its hollow eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. "Where's Ryan?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The figure smiled. "Come outside," it said again. I never saw Ryan again. The camp shut down a week later, the parents pulling their kids out after the police failed to find any trace of him. I tried to move on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, waiting for me to step back into the woods. And sometimes, late at night, I hear it, the soft, raspy voice whispering, "Come outside." And I know it's still there, waiting. I never liked driving at night. There's something about the way the darkness presses against the windows, turning the world outside into a black void, that makes me uneasy. But sometimes you don't have a choice. That night, I was driving home from my friend Katie's house. It was late, almost midnight, and the road was empty, just a long stretch of pavement cutting through fields and forest. I rolled the windows down, letting the cool night air wake me up as I turned up the radio. Everything felt fine, at least until I noticed the car. It was behind me, its headlights bright in my rearview mirror. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was someone else driving home late, just like me. But the longer it stayed there, the more I started to feel off. The car didn't try to pass me, even though the road was wide and empty. It just stayed there, trailing me like a shadow. I tapped the brakes, hoping the driver would get the hint and go around. But they didn't. The car followed me for miles, its headlights glaring in my rearview mirror. My stomach twisted as I realized something wasn't right. I grabbed my phone and opened the Maps app, searching for a gas station or a convenience store where I could stop. But there was nothing, just miles and miles of empty road. Finally, I reached an intersection. I took a sharp right, hoping to lose the car. For a moment, I thought it had worked. The road behind me was dark and empty, and I let out a shaky breath, gripping the steering wheel tightly. But then I saw them, headlights, coming up fast in the rearview mirror. The car was back, closer this time. Its headlights so bright they lit up the inside of my car. My chest tightened as I pressed the gas pedal, the engine whining as I sped down the road. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The car didn't answer, of course. It just stayed behind me, its headlights burning into my eyes. I don't know how long it followed me. It felt like hours, but it was probably only minutes. Finally, I saw it, a small diner, its neon sign flickering in the darkness. I pulled into the parking lot, my tires screeching as I came to a stop. The car drove past, its headlights disappearing into the night. I sat there for a moment, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. "It's fine," I whispered to myself. "It's over." But as I got out of the car and walked toward the diner, I felt it, that strange, heavy feeling, like I was being watched. I glanced back at my car, the dark windows reflecting the flickering neon light. That's when I saw it, a face, staring at me from the back seat. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The face was pale and hollow, with sunken eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. It didn't move. It just stared at me, its mouth twisted into a wide, unnatural grin. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the curb as I fumbled for my phone. When I looked back, the face was gone. I didn't go into the diner. Instead, I got back in the car, my heart pounding as I locked the doors and started the engine. The car was empty. At least, I thought it was. I drove the rest of the way home with the radio off, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds. The road was dark and empty, the silence broken only by the hum of the engine and the faint rustling of the wind. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I sat there for a moment, staring at the house. The windows were dark, and the porch light flickered faintly in the breeze. I grabbed my bag and opened the door, glancing into the back seat one last time. It was empty. I locked the car and hurried inside, my chest tightening with every step. When I reached my room, I closed the door and leaned against it, letting out a shaky breath. "You're just tired," I whispered to myself. "It's all in your head." But as I turned toward the bed, I saw it. The face. It was in the mirror, staring back at me with those dark, hollow eyes and that twisted grin. I screamed, stumbling back against the door. When I looked again, the face was gone. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the face, its empty eyes burning into mine. The next morning, I told my parents what had happened. They didn't believe me, of course. "You were just tired," my mom said, shaking her head. "It was probably a shadow." But I knew what I saw. I stopped driving at night after that. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the car, I catch a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror. A shadow, a flash of pale skin, a pair of dark, hollow eyes. And I know it's still there, waiting for me to turn around. It started with a knock at the door. It was late, around 11:30 p.m., and I was home alone, curled up on the couch watching TV. The sound startled me, echoing through the quiet house. At first, I thought it was the wind. It had been raining all evening, the trees swaying outside the window as the storm rolled in. But then the knock came again, louder this time. I grabbed my phone and crept toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest. "Who is it?" I called, my voice shaking. No response. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the lock. The knock came again, slow and deliberate, followed by the faint sound of heavy breathing. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. Still no response. I leaned closer, peering through the peephole. At first, I didn't see anything, just the faint glow of the porch light reflecting off the rain-soaked driveway. Then he stepped into view. He was wearing a bright yellow rain jacket, the hood pulled up over his head so I couldn't see his face. He stood perfectly still, his arms hanging at his sides, the rain dripping off his jacket and pooling around his feet. "Can I help you?" I called through the door, trying to keep my voice steady. The man didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at the door. I backed away, my stomach twisting as I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. "There's a man outside my house," I whispered, glancing back at the door. "Is he trying to get in?" the operator asked. "No," I said, my voice shaking. "He's just standing there." "Stay on the line," she said. "We're sending someone to check it out." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me, and retreated to the kitchen, my hands trembling as I clutched the phone. But when I looked back at the door, the man was gone. The police arrived about 15 minutes later, their headlights cutting through the darkness as they pulled into the driveway. I stepped outside, the rain soaking through my socks as I pointed toward the porch. "He was standing right there," I said, my voice trembling. One of the officers nodded, shining his flashlight around the yard. They searched the property, checking the driveway, the backyard, even the woods at the edge of the lot. But they didn't find anything. "You probably scared him off," one of the officers said, giving me a reassuring smile. I nodded, even though I didn't believe him. After they left, I double-checked all the locks and turned on every light in the house, my stomach twisting with unease. But the rest of the night was quiet. By morning, I had almost convinced myself it was just a prank, a drunk guy or a lost hiker looking for shelter. But then the photos started showing up. The first one arrived in my mailbox 2 days later. It was a Polaroid, the edges worn and smudged, with no return address. When I pulled it out of the envelope, my blood ran cold. It was a picture of my house, taken from the edge of the woods. I could see the living room window, the faint glow of the TV visible through the curtains. And in the corner of the photo, just barely visible, was the man in the yellow jacket. I called the police again, showing them the photo and explaining what had happened. "Are you sure it's the same guy?" one of the officers asked, studying the picture. "Yes," I said, my voice trembling. They promised to keep an eye on the neighborhood and told me to call if anything else happened. But I could tell they didn't take me seriously. Over the next few days, more photos arrived. One was of the backyard, the swing set barely visible in the darkness. Another was of the kitchen window, taken from just a few feet away. But the worst one was of my bedroom. It was taken at night, the curtains slightly parted, showing me lying in bed. I called the police again, but they still couldn't find anything. I started sleeping with the lights on, a baseball bat under my bed and my phone clutched tightly in my hand. Every creak and groan of the house made my chest tighten. Every shadow felt like it was watching me. Then, one night, I heard it. The knock. It was softer this time, almost polite, but it still sent a chill down my spine. I grabbed the bat and crept toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest. Through the peephole, I saw him, the man in the yellow jacket, standing in the rain, his head tilted to the side like he was waiting for me to answer. "Go away," I shouted, my voice shaking. He didn't move. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a faint, raspy whisper. "Let me in." I stumbled back, clutching the bat as the knock turned into pounding, the door shaking on its hinges. "Leave me alone," I screamed. The pounding stopped. For a moment, the house was silent, the only sound the rain tapping against the windows. Then I heard it. Footsteps, coming from inside the house. I froze, my chest tightening as the sound of wet boots echoed down the hallway. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The footsteps stopped, followed by a low, guttural laugh. I ran to my room, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. The laugh grew louder, echoing through the house as I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. "Please," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "He's inside." When the police arrived, the house was empty. There were no wet footprints, no signs of forced entry, nothing to suggest anyone had been there. But I knew the truth. The man in the yellow jacket wasn't gone. He was still out there, watching. The photos stopped after that night, but I still feel him sometimes. When I'm alone in the house or walking down an empty street, I feel his eyes on me, waiting for the right moment to knock again. And I know that next time, I might not be able to keep him out. When I first moved into my apartment, I thought it was perfect. It was small but cozy, with big windows that let in lots of sunlight and a tiny balcony where I could drink my coffee in the mornings. The building was old, but it had charm. Creaky wooden floors, high ceilings, and a spiral staircase that led to an attic. The landlord told me the attic was just for storage, and I didn't think much of it. I didn't have a lot of stuff, so I never bothered to go up there. At least, not at first. The first time I heard it, I was lying in bed, half asleep. It was faint, barely audible, like the sound of someone walking across the ceiling. I told myself it was just the building settling, or maybe a raccoon that had gotten inside. But the next night, it happened again. This time, it was louder, slow, deliberate footsteps moving back and forth above my bedroom. I told the landlord about it the next morning. "Do you think there's an animal in the attic?" I asked. He frowned, shaking his head. "No one's been up there in years. It's probably just the pipes or the wind." I wanted to believe him, but the footsteps didn't stop. A few nights later, I was sitting on the couch, watching TV, when I heard it again. The footsteps were heavier this time, almost like boots stomping across the wooden floor of the attic. I grabbed a broom and stood under the attic door, my heart pounding as I stared at the hatch. "Is someone up there?" I called, my voice shaking. The footsteps stopped. I waited, holding my breath, but there was no response. Finally, I worked up the courage to pull down the ladder, the hinges creaking as the hatch swung open. A wave of cold air rushed down, sending chills up my spine. I climbed the ladder slowly, my flashlight shaking in my hand as I peered into the darkness. The attic was empty. I let out a shaky breath, telling myself I was imagining things. But as I turned to go back down the ladder, something caught my eye. In the corner of the attic, half hidden by a pile of dusty boxes, was a door. It was small, barely big enough for a child to fit through, and the paint was chipped and peeling. I didn't remember the landlord mentioning a door. I crept toward it, my stomach twisting with unease. The door had no handle, just a rusted keyhole that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. I pressed my ear to the wood, holding my breath. For a moment, there was nothing. Then I heard it, a faint, shuffling sound, like something moving on the other side. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a box as I scrambled down the ladder. I slammed the hatch shut and locked it, my heart pounding in my chest. That night, I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps, pacing back and forth above me. The next morning, I called the landlord again. "There's something in the attic," I said, my voice trembling. "Like what?" he asked, sounding annoyed. "I don't know," I said, "but there's a door up there, and I think something's behind it." "A door?" he said, his voice softening. "Yes," I said. "Didn't you know about it?" There was a long pause. Then he said, "I'll be over this afternoon." When the landlord arrived, he seemed nervous, glancing around the apartment like he was expecting something to jump out at him. "Show me the attic," he said. I pulled down the ladder and stepped aside, letting him climb up first. He was only up there for a few minutes before he came back down, his face pale. "There's nothing up there," he said, avoiding my eyes. "But the door." "It's just an old storage room," he said quickly. "Nothing to worry about." I wanted to argue, but the look on his face stopped me. That night, the noises got worse. It wasn't just footsteps anymore. I heard scratching, like nails dragging across the wooden floor, and faint whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I sat on the couch, clutching a baseball bat and staring at the attic hatch, my chest tight with fear. Then, just after midnight, the hatch opened. It happened so slowly I almost didn't notice at first. The ladder creaked as it unfolded, the sound echoing through the silent apartment. I froze, my heart racing as I stared at the open hatch. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. The scratching stopped. For a moment, the apartment was silent. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl, coming from the attic. I grabbed my phone and called 911. My hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. "There's someone in my attic," I whispered, glancing at the hatch. "Stay on the line," the operator said. "Help is on the way." I backed into the corner of the room, clutching the baseball bat as the growling grew louder. Then, something stepped onto the ladder. It was tall and hunched, its limbs too long and its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, locking onto me as it climbed down the ladder, one slow step at a time. I screamed, throwing the baseball bat as hard as I could. It didn't flinch. The next thing I remember, the police were there, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they searched the apartment. "There's nothing here," one of them said, shaking his head. "But I saw it," I said, my voice trembling. They didn't believe me, of course, but I know what I saw. I moved out of the apartment the next day, leaving most of my things behind. I never told anyone else about the attic or the thing that came out of it. But sometimes, late at night, I hear it, the sound of footsteps pacing above me, and I know it's still out there, waiting for someone else to open the hatch. When I moved into my dorm for my first year of college, I was thrilled. It wasn't the nicest place. Peeling paint on the walls, outdated furniture, and a faint smell of mildew that no amount of air freshener could fix. But it was my first taste of independence. I didn't even mind that I had to share the bathroom with the entire floor. The hallway where my dorm room was located was long and narrow, with fluorescent lights that flickered faintly whenever you walked by. There were rooms on both sides, but my room was near the end of the hall, and directly across from my room was the last door, the one no one ever opened. The door was different from the others. While the rest of the dorm doors had small, rectangular windows so you could see inside, this one was solid metal, painted a dull gray. It didn't have a nameplate or a room number, and it didn't have a peephole like the other doors. At first, I thought it was a storage closet or something, but when I asked my roommate, Sarah, about it, she just shrugged. "No one knows," she said, flipping through her biology textbook. "I've heard a bunch of different stories, though. Some people say it used to be a janitor's closet. Others say it's sealed off because something bad happened in there." "Like what?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. She glanced at the door, lowering her voice. "I don't know, but I've heard people say they've seen things." I laughed it off, figuring she was just trying to freak me out. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop staring at the door. The hallway was dark and quiet, the faint hum of the fluorescent lights the only sound. But as I started to drift off, I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping, coming from the direction of the door. I sat up, my chest tightening as I stared at the gray door. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate, like someone was knocking but didn't want to be heard. "Sarah," I whispered, nudging her awake. "What?" she mumbled, rubbing her eyes. "Do you hear that?" She sat up, frowning as she listened. The tapping stopped. "You're imagining things," she said, lying back down and pulling the blanket over her head. But I knew I wasn't. Over the next few days, I started noticing other things. Sometimes, when I walked down the hall, I felt like someone was watching me. Other times, I'd hear faint whispers, just at the edge of my hearing, that seemed to come from behind the gray door. I told myself it was just my imagination. After all, dorm buildings were old, and old buildings made weird noises. But then, one night, I saw her. It was around midnight, and I was walking back from the common room after finishing some homework. The hallway was dimly lit, the lights flickering faintly as I made my way toward my room. That's when I saw her. She was standing at the end of the hall, near the gray door. She was pale and thin, her long, dark hair hanging over her face. She wore a simple white dress that looked old and faded, like it hadn't been washed in years. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. She didn't respond. I took a step closer, my heart pounding in my chest. "Are you okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She slowly turned her head, her hair falling away to reveal her face. Her eyes were dark and sunken, her skin pale and almost translucent, and she was smiling, a wide, unnatural smile that stretched across her face like it didn't belong there. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as she lifted a thin, bony hand and pointed toward the gray door. "Come inside," she whispered, her voice soft and raspy. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet as I turned and bolted down the hall. When I reached my room, I slammed the door shut and locked it, my chest heaving as I leaned against the wall. When I told Sarah what had happened, she just stared at me, her face pale. "You saw her," she whispered. According to Sarah, the girl was a legend on campus. "She used to live in that room," she said, nodding toward the gray door. "But something happened to her. No one knows what, but they say she never left." I laughed nervously, shaking my head. "You're messing with me." "I'm not," she said, her voice serious. "People have been seeing her for years, and everyone who sees her—" "What?" "They say she tries to get you to open the door." That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak and groan of the building made my chest tighten, and I kept glancing at the door, half expecting to see her standing there again. Around 3 a.m., I heard it. The tapping. It was louder this time, more insistent, and it was coming from directly outside my room. "Sarah," I whispered, shaking her awake. She sat up, her eyes wide. "What is that?" The tapping turned into pounding, the sound echoing through the silent hallway. "Don't open the door," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm not going to." I hissed, clutching the blanket tightly. The pounding stopped. For a moment, the room was silent. Then we heard it, a faint, raspy whisper coming from the other side of the door. "Let me in." I grabbed my phone and dialed campus security, my hands shaking as I explained what was happening. When they arrived, the hallway was empty. "There's no one here," one of the officers said, shining his flashlight around. "But we heard her," I said, my voice trembling. They didn't believe us, of course, but I knew she was real. Over the next few weeks, the noises got worse. The tapping and whispers became a nightly occurrence, and I started noticing other things. Faint handprints on the windows, shadows moving under the door, the feeling of cold fingers brushing against my arm when no one was there. I begged the dorm supervisor to move me to another floor, but she said there were no open rooms. So I stayed, and every night, I listened to the girl at the end of the hall, waiting for me to open the door. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. The pounding was so loud, the whispers so insistent, that I finally grabbed the baseball bat from under my bed and stormed into the hallway. The gray door was open. I froze, staring at the dark, gaping doorway. A faint light flickered inside, casting long shadows on the walls. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaking. The girl stepped into the light, her wide smile stretching across her face as she held out a hand. "Come inside," she whispered. I ran. I didn't stop until I was outside, the cool night air stinging my face as I gasped for breath. The next day, I packed my things and moved off campus, leaving the dorm and the gray door behind. I never went back, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear it, the soft tapping, the faint whispers, the girl's voice calling to me, "Come inside." And I know she's still waiting.